great to see everyone here this morning. It is also wonderful to see all the children here and the families represented. We're so glad you came to Stones Hill. And it looks like there's going to be a lot of busy people this morning. So really glad to have your families here. It's a delight and a privilege. I'm Joey, and it's my privilege to talk to you again out of the Bible this week. And we just started last week a series that we're calling The Spiritual Dark Ages, A Hero Must Rise. And what I want to talk to you again today are some introductory things that we need to kind of establish early on in this series. And so I will do that this morning once again, and then we'll deal with a particular problem that the study of the book of Judges presents to us. We have to be honest with that. And I'm going to demonstrate, I think, this morning, as the Lord leads, that God is just, He's good, He's loving, despite some of the things that we read and some of the initial impressions that we may have upon reading a book like the book of Judges in the Old Testament. And then before I launch into this, though, just know that you're loved and you're cared for. Some of you need to hear that today, and maybe you've had a tough week. Maybe you're trying to transition from one phase of life to another. Maybe there's some relationship stuff going on in your family, your marriage. And just know that you're loved and you're cared for. And this place is always a safe place for you. You don't have to worry about saving face with me in dealing with some of the issues in your life. You'll always be safe here. I'll never treat you any different. Regardless of how you, sometimes people will obey and walk in the truth. Sometimes they don't obey and walk in the truth, just like me, just like you. But we are committed to loving all the way, and that's what we hold those two tandem themes in close proximity: loving all the way, but truth-telling nevertheless, and never stopping to love as a result. So just know this, and this is a powerful, I think, what's going to turn out to be a powerful series. And I'm going to especially invite our young people today to listen, because I really feel like that a hero must rise, and this has to do with the spiritual darkness and the ages of our time. No book in the Bible, I think, is a better, more fitting description than what we see the trends in the world today, and represent those trends like the book of Judges that we see in the world today. We talked about the book of Judges last week. We talked about it was a 300 to 350 year period in Israel's history when there was darkness over the land, really. There were some bright spots. Some heroes did rise, but unfortunately the victory was short-lived in many cases, and the people continued a downward trend toward the decadence and depravity that characterized the time. We know from last week that no leader replaced Joshua after the conquest, and we will be looking at the moral problem of the conquest, because a lot of people you're going to find, in fact, I've kind of blogged with people along the way in my life, atheists, other people, non-believers, people who have issues with the church, God, Christianity, the Bible. One of the big arguments that they will present is the fact that they seem to see a God of hatred, a God of cruelty, a barbaric God in the Old Testament, and this will be used as a reason why they are not going to pursue this thing we call the spiritual life, or God, or religion, Jesus, anything that has to do with those things, because God is a messed up being, and we see that in the Old Testament, quote unquote. This is the argument that's often presented. And so what I'm going to do today is I have to help you personally resolve this issue in your own mind and heart, because I know if you've read the Bible and the Old Testament and the book of Judges, like I've recommended that you do, it just seems that, and the book of Joshua as well, and the conquest, it just seems that God, there's some unresolved issues there, and I want to resolve that for you in your own mind. Secondly, I want to help you help others resolve the problem. Some people call it apologetics, and you have opportunity to grow in this area of your life. But we have to be able to answer these difficult questions, and I just want to encourage you here at Stones Hill that you can bombard the text with questions. You can interrogate the Bible. You can challenge it. It's very robust. It will stand the test of time. And there are legitimate, intellectually satisfying answers to your deepest questions. So you've got to stay with it And that's what I'm going to help you do this morning, is to kind of stay with this and be able to see and understand that God is good, despite what maybe apparently seems contrary to that goodness. And then I want to just encourage you this morning that God doesn't miss a thing. We have to take responsibility for our moral messes. I know that's not popular today. But unless we take responsibility for our moral messes in our lives personally, family, community, then it impacts a nation in time. And so I'm going to encourage you to take responsibility for the moral messes of our own lives, in your life and my life. And I'm not talking about moralism. Now, moralism is something we have to guard against, and that is that if I'm a good moral person, then I'm okay. And what I think we see is that there's two ways that we show rebellion in this regard. One is that we flaunt God's commandments, and we don't even try to keep them. It's like, why bother? I'm just going to live the way I want to live, the way the culture says I should live and can live and have a right to live, and I'm just going to live that way, and I'll flaunt the moral principles of God. That's one thing that we do. A second thing is that we do is that we actually keep the moral principles of God, and we nail everyone to the wall who doesn't. That's moralism. That's saying that, okay, if we just are a moral person, then we can check it all the things off, and we're okay with God, and spiritually we're going to thrive. Not the case at all. Some people have a righteousness by moralism, and that's not what I'm talking about this morning. What I'm talking about is that, and I mentioned this last week, is when we look at sin in its final analysis, and I know that's not a big word that people like to use today, but when we look at sin in its final analysis, it is a rejection of a right relationship with God. I am not going to be in a right relationship with God. That's what it is in its final analysis. You can get theological and technical, and you can get dictionary driven in your definitions of sin, but when you look at the ramifications of it, it is a rejection of a right relationship with God. Now, I emphasize the word right because you are in a relationship with God, whether you want to be or not this morning. It may be a bad one of your own choosing, but you are in a relationship with God. The question is a right relationship with God? Am I relating to myself, to my family, to my world, to my God in a way that He has asked me to? And if not, what are the implications from this? What am I going to have to deal with in my life should I choose to do it my way? And that's what we have to look at. And so this is a high challenge series in that I'm going to ask you to take responsibility for your moral messes. And not to exclude you. Not to assault self-esteem or self-worth. By no means. It's not for any of those reasons. It's instead to help you look at your life, and all of us to look at our lives and to see what lifestyle decisions we make that contribute to the overall decadence that we see in the world. We have to assume responsibility for ourselves. And to do that, we have to look at our hearts. And we have to realize that all that we see, especially in moral areas and family areas and leadership areas, all that we see, the stuff that we're seeing today, it is all symptomatic of a far deeper issue in our hearts and our lives. It is symptomatic of a far greater problem. And that is that I am refusing to be in a right relationship with God. And I want to help move us toward a right relationship with God. And I think this series will help us to do this. And we have to do it by owning our stuff. Okay? So I think we understand that Joshua was leading. That he broke the ability of the Canaanites to organize resistance against Israel. So they conquered the land. And each of the tribes got a tribal inheritance. And the command was clear to clear the rest of the territories, the little pockets of rebellion that would rise up at times within the land of Israel. And they would, heroes or judges would be raised up to lead against these little pockets of guerrilla warfare that would break out in all aspects of the land, the north, the central, and the southern parts of the land of Israel. Okay, and so, but what was happening is that Joshua was not replaced. And what we find, even though the people got a good start in the tribes in Judah, as we're going to read here this probably today, and then next week some as well out of Judges 1, what we're going to see is that the tribes failed to comply in full obedience. Instead, they were just partial in their following of God and His will. And this plays out large in the end because it positions them in a position of weakness. And like I said last week, instead of wolves at the door, maybe in our lives, it's more like termites in the floor. There's little things, little decisions made. And when we make these decisions, little moral decisions, little leadership decisions, little family decisions, they seem little, but when we make enough of them and they accumulate and they pile up, what happens? It presents a crisis, and the floor of our life is not adequate. The joist and the lumber of our lives is not adequate to hold up the weight of the life that we've chosen to lead. And then there's collapse. And Judges shows us this. And so this is what begins to happen. And as I was studying this week and kind of getting myself ready for this, I realized that some of you have some major problems with what you have read in the book of Judges. And I can understand and sympathize with that issue and that problem. And so I really feel like I need to deal with it. So in verse 1, we read up on the screen in slide 7, you're going to read, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord. So it's after the death of Joshua, but it's before Israel had a king. And so there's a lack of leadership. There's a vacuum. Okay? The Israelites asked the Lord, who of us is to go up, that is higher in elevation from where we currently are, first to fight against the Canaanites? And that's a problem from the get-go for many, many people. Why would God, how could God, a loving, merciful God, condone warfare? How could He encourage it? How could He even be a participant in such activity? It's so barbaric. It's so primitive. How can God even have anything to do with this? And this is what's called the moral problem of the conquest. It's a moral issue. And I just want to say right off the get-go here that God is not only loving, but He's holy and He's just, and He brings wise judgment upon the rebellious. Otherwise, if God does not hold us accountable for the decisions that we make, then what happens is all of creation is sabotaged. And there's no safe place for anybody anymore because evil runs rampant and it reigns. And spiritual degeneration dominates, and there's a spiritual dark age. And so God has to hold us accountable. It's part of who He is. It's embedded in His nature. And what we also have to consider is that although the Canaanites had been increasing in wickedness for more than 700 years, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but for 400 to 700 years, this culture had evolved and had grown, and it had also decayed and deteriorated. And so for 700 years, God had exhibited grace after grace after grace, letting the sun come up and go down, letting the seasons come and go, letting the crops grow and be harvested, letting the children be born, letting the society exist and go. In some cases, maybe it thrived, but not very long because of the decadence of it. And so for 700 years, God has blessed this people group with mercy, kindness. 700 years, God has exhibited His grace to them. But then we read something very interesting in Genesis 15, verse 16. The time for judgment had now come. Genesis 15:16 says, Abraham is in the middle of the Abrahamic covenant being made with Abram. Abram at the time, not Abraham, but Abram at the time, before his name change. And in the 4th generation, God says to Abram, your descendants will come back here. That is, back here in the land of promise, where the Canaanites currently live, even though they were called Amorites in Abram's day. You will come back here, Abram, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. 400 years transpires. Sure enough, God's promise is true. They come back. And by that time, the full measure of their cultural sin had reached a level where God says enough is enough. It's time to hold this society accountable. And so God told Abram, once again, to slow it down. Listen closely. God told Abram In 2091 BC, he said the Amorites, that is the forebears of the Canaanites, the wickedness would reach a full measure. And in fact, it does in 1350 BC. And so God uses war both to punish the guilty, to hold us accountable, and to protect His people from the corrupting influences of idolatry and moral depravity as practiced by the people of the land. We see this clearly in Numbers 33:55 and other places. Now, like I said, some may feel that it was unfair for God to command the Israelites to war against the Canaanites, wiping out mother and father and entire families. How could God have anything to do with this? And what you have to bear in mind, again, reiterating, is that God actually was very gracious with the Canaanites for about 700 years. He had put up with their decadence and depravity over the centuries. He had put up, and this is confirmed, He had put up with their bestiality, their widespread prostitution, their homosexuality, and their incestuous practices. It had grown exponentially over the years. God had put up with it. But finally, the time came when God said, enough is enough. And He uses His own people to do so. Now God is fair, and as we study Old Testament history, what we realize is that in 722 BC, the Assyrians were used by God to discipline His very own people, Israel. The very ones whose ancestors had led in the period of the Judges and the conquest under Joshua. He's allowed these people, His very own, to go into captivity under the Assyrian captivity in 722 BC. Also in 586 BC, the southern kingdom of Israel goes into captivity, and the nation of Judah and others go into captivity, and they're carried off, and some of them get to return after a period of 70 years. But what I'm saying is that God plays by His own rules. His people play by His own rules. God used a nation to discipline Israel, just like He used Israel here to discipline the nations. So they have to play by their same rules, and in fact, they do this. And if any nation chooses to flaunt God, if any nation chooses to reject His love, if any nation chooses to go their own moral way and reject a right relationship with God, then God allows them to experience a measure of discipline and defeat in order to turn their hearts toward home. In the book of Judges, the Canaanites had existed again for centuries, as many as 700 years. They had the witness of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had the witness of these men of God who led their families, trying to lead a society, renewal in a society that was getting increasingly corrupt. And eventually God says, enough is enough. And even though Judges 1 raises the so-called moral problem of the conquest, what we have to realize, we have to understand the bigger picture of what was actually going on in the land of Canaan and the Canaanites and the behavior and the practices of their lives. I've heard it so many times. How horrid, Pastor, that Israel would butcher the innocent Canaanites. How horrible, Pastor, that they would wreak havoc and misery and grab their land and take the land that really belonged to the Canaanites in the first place. How horrible that God would have the audacity to do this to this innocent people. And all this allegedly at Yahweh's command. Well, what you have to know is that the Canaanite culture wasn't as innocent as people would have you to believe. In fact, we'll look at slide 17 in just a second. Just go ahead and pull slide 17 up. It's a quotation from Leviticus 18, 6 through 30. And we'll look at another one in Deuteronomy 18, 9 through 14. And I'm sorry I have to be so crude this morning. I apologize. But in order for you to understand the moral problem of the Canaanites and that God is in fact justified to treat them exactly as He treats them in the time of the conquest in Joshua and the time of the Judges, He's exactly justified. He is holy and just and pure and right. He's the judge of all the earth. Abraham says, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? I can rest confident in who God really is. And what we've got to realize, and again, apologize for having to be crude, but when we look and analyze the biblical data, and we look at the archaeological finds, and we do some investigation, what we find is the Canaanite people had deteriorated to such an extent. There was sex with relatives. There was sex with mother, sex with father's wife, sex with siblings, sex with your grandchild, sex with your aunt, sex with your daughter-in-law, sex with your neighbor's wife, sacrifice your child to Moloch if you really are intense about something. These were the trends. Leviticus sums it up. In fact, it says, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. Not exactly a great word picture if you overate on the greasy sausage patties this morning. But it's a very vivid one. The earth is personified here in the book of Leviticus. And if it had a mouth, it would open up, and well, you get the picture. The land vomited out its inhabitants, but you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled, and if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Wow. You get the feeling that there comes a point in God's great justice and love and mercy where He says, you know what? Enough of this. Enough of this. Deuteronomy 18:9 says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you. Slide number 18 on the screen. Do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire. This is what Canaanite culture had reduced to. If you had some situation or you needed the intervention of God and you really wanted to prove to the deities how serious you were, you would take your precious born son or daughter and you would offer them as a sacrifice. This is what they were doing. Moses says, don't you go there. Who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of these same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. And so you see, God is justified. You have a culture that had incubated this immoral freefall society. And it had grown over hundreds of years. And God eventually says that there's a time where we got to hold people accountable. There's an act of justice. And my tool of justice, the scalpel of justice that I'm going to have to use is my own people Israel. And I've got a plan for them. But I'm going to use them to discipline and even to correct, even to judge. And have the audacity to hold accountable a Canaanite culture that had driven people farther and farther and farther from what God's created intention and design was for them in the beginning. So and in a way, this morning, I don't have much sympathy. I don't have much. I do have sympathy for those who struggle maybe to understand this. But what I don't understand, what I don't can no longer, in light of my research, can no longer really tolerate is this poor Canaanite talk. The poor, innocent Canaanites. It's not that way, friends. It was a culture where they would rape your wife and daughter and make you witness it. It was a culture where they would sacrifice your child on a day trip to the market and you left him or her behind. Enough of this poor, innocent Canaanite talk. This was a vile culture. It was a wicked culture. And it's a cruel culture. And God is justified in what He does here in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. He's justified. And He says enough is enough. And you know, sometimes it seems like everybody's in debate mode these days. And sometimes I think in debates, you know, people want to pick up and throw stones at the biblical conquest led by Joshua and commanded by God and carried out by His people. And I think as I look at America and I look at some of the decisions we have made and some of the decisions our culture upholds as a good thing, I look at us and I think we have forfeited all rights to throw the first stone at the biblical conquest. We have no right. We have been making movies about violent things for years, and we vicariously and avidly consume and gorge ourselves with those year after year after year. And yet we want to pick up a stone and throw it at the God of the conquest. I could get into a lot of other issues, friends, and issues that relate to our morals, issues that relate to our sloppy birth control methods, and the extent that we go to correct what we would call mistakes. I could get into these issues, but I don't think this morning that Americans have the right to pick up and throw the first stone at what God is doing in the conquest. I don't think we have the room. In the words of one of my friends, what you talking about? What you talking about? Do you understand what this culture was? You know, I think we have forfeited the moral authority here in what we have done in our own nation. Here are some additional considerations on the Canaanites. And stay with me here because, like I said, I'm going to shore this up in your own mind. And I'm also going to position you to be able to dialogue with others who struggle with this issue. And here's some 4 or 5 just ancillary points I would make regarding this issue this morning. First of all, not only these basic summary things that we've read in the Leviticus and Deuteronomy are true, but first of all, the Canaanite culture was a revenge-driven society. What I mean by that is, if you didn't avenge your family member's death, if somebody killed my daddy and I lived in that culture and I did not avenge his death, I was not a son. I did not belong with my people. I was not loyal to my people, and I was not fit to live. And so it was a culture that incubated this revenge-driven motif. And if you didn't effect revenge on those who had slighted your family and those who had harmed or even taken someone that you loved, then your life had to end. And so it was a revenge-driven society. It's like, well, couldn't God just let a few of them live? Couldn't just let 1 or 2 live, or maybe spare a few families? What you have to understand is that if they would live, they would wreak revenge on the Lord's people. They would never be safe. It was revenge-driven. Secondly, the resources of the time would not permit massive incarcerations. The penal system was limited in who they could keep alive and still be a safe place to live. And they didn't have these massive prisons to house people in for years at a time. The judgment had to be extreme. There was no way they could house these captives of war. Third, they practiced child sacrifice, and we've already alluded to this. And if your culture endorses this, it's got to go. When you sacrifice your children, and when you look at what we have done, even nationally, the positions we have taken on certain issues, and all according to a postmodern worldview and a value set. When you look at what we have done, we begin to understand that there is a time when the full measure eventually comes. And we all have to look at that and take a sober look at that. I think the fourth thing is, when a people group is taken in judgment, it doesn't necessarily mean that all, including the children, went to hell. Not at all. Just because children died in the Canaanite conquest, just because an entire people group was commanded to be wiped out, even though they weren't, and they did not obey fully. But just because it was, a family is wiped out doesn't mean that their eternal destiny has been sealed in hell. That there is a place of judgment, and while their leaders and their cultural influencers led them down a wrong path, sometimes families pay a price for what mommies and daddies end up doing with their lives. Mommies and daddies put them in harm's way. And in this case, I don't think we can conclude that children go to hell in the conquest. I think that instead those kinds of eternal destinies rest with God. And so there is not really we don't know where people go. That's up to God, totally. And then finally, I think we have to look at another issue related here, and that is that the Canaanites had to be destroyed because God's chosen people were going to produce a Messiah. And he was going to be the Savior of the world. And the Canaanites would have killed every last one of them if given the opportunity to do so. And so God's protecting and incubating a messianic seed that would eventually be born in the line of the tribe of Judah, in the lineage of the line of the tribe of Judah, who eventually is raised up and doesn't just deliver his people in a military battle from in the world. Instead, he's strung up on a cross and he dies a death, so that everybody, including Canaanite-driven people and cultures, can look to him and be renewed and restored, and can look to him and find salvation, forgiveness, and a new beginning. Listen, it's enough of this talk about God being tribal and bipolar and violent or a child abuser. Like the phrase of my friend, what you talking about? What you talking about? God is fully justified in how he has behaved and what he has done. Listen, as we look into this issue of warfare a little further in the Old Testament, we see warfare in Israel was a sacred event. It's a warfare undertaken at God's command and in his presence. And many times the Israelites would approach battles much like it would approach worship in the sanctuary. It's not like these are bloodthirsty people with swords and whips and ready to wreak havoc in their depravity. No, they understood the role that God was calling them to. And they approached it like they would approach worship. The soldiers would consecrate themselves, 1 Samuel 13. Sacrifices were made to God, and the soldiers would consecrate themselves in Joshua 3:5. And they would abstain from certain things. Set themselves apart, pray, make sure they had the mind of the Lord, make sure they're not getting into their selfish modes of ambition, and they're going to wreak revenge on people just for the sake of wreaking revenge. No, they had to get their heart right. And when Israel marched against Jericho, what we see, the procession of the priests and the Ark of the Covenant, the footstool or portable throne of God, it led the way. It led the way. And they symbolized God's presence and leadership in the battle. Listen, war was an act of worship when it's in accordance with God's plan. When the full measure of sin reaches its height, God uses means and methods appropriate to hold us accountable for what we have done. You see, when the baby started dying in ancient Canaanite culture, and when the morality was twisted beyond repair, God finally reached a tipping point with the nation, and he said, enough is enough. I think of the book this morning by Malcolm Gladwell. It's entitled The Tipping Point. It's a very interesting read. It's a kind of a social issue-driven book. And the book talks about the little things that can make a big difference in our lives. According to Gladwell, there's a tipping point in every community when if you get enough bad things together happening, the community will tank. It starts with graffiti and defacing the buildings and public property and maybe the bridge overpasses and the railroad trestles and bridges, and you begin to paint and although some of that artwork is pretty daggone good, that's where it kind of begins. You begin to deface property in the community. According to Gladwell, maybe a window will get broken and it doesn't get repaired right away, and it suggests that no one really cares. And no one is really in charge. So another window gets broken, and then another window gets broken, and finally someone does a drug deal, and law enforcement will turn their head, and finally people stop picking up their trash, and they begin to do things on the street, showing no respect for public property and the street and the sidewalks. And on it goes until it finally comes to a point, according to Gladwell, in a community, it reaches a tipping point, and there's a mass exodus of all the people in that community who could have made a difference. They leave. They choose to up and leave because they find it's beyond repair. Malcolm Gladwell entitled his book The Tipping Point, and he talks about this in his book. I was thinking about that book this week while I was doing this research on the Canaanite culture, on God's dealing with the Canaanite culture and trying to compare it to maybe our culture today, seeing the parallels. And by the way, there are some other crazy stuff happening in Judges, and you're going to have to stay with me because you're going to see some parallels as we work our way through these stories. But I was thinking about applying Gladwell's thesis nationally, and when you get enough of the little things working in conjunction with other negative trends, then you eventually reach a tipping point. There's a point where things are on the verge of collapse, and it usually can happen in a dramatic moment. Here's how it goes. The family breaks down. Kids don't have daddies. Mothers fail to nurture. Marriages fall apart. The kids don't want any part of it when they get older because they have seen so many poor examples of it and also been hurt by it. Homosexual marriages begin to usurp God's design for raising a family. The value systems of these families are turned on their heads, and this is how it starts. The family begins to fall apart. The young men and women in these families are not taught to honor God, not in any area of their life, but especially their morality. They roam freely. They have no moral guidance. There's no stable mentors in their lives because the culture has decided that being a part of a truth-telling church family is optional. No need to go there and get your values shaped. And then the media begins to loosen all moral resolve. And most of the programming is designed to promote a worldview where everyone does, dare I say it, what is right in their own eyes. And the nation begins to elect leaders who have been educated in the finest secular institutions of our day and who accommodate the general public's new definitions of family and morality and the meaning of life. Hear me now. And they will even elect leaders who will drive them into the ground of self-destruction so long as they are promised a job and the moral freedom to live as we want. It is like polishing the deck of the Titanic while she's getting ready to tip and go down. And who is worried about polishing the deck of the Titanic when she's tipping and on her way down? Friends, again, this is not Chicken Little, alarmist, sky is falling. It's not wolves at the door. It's termites in the floor. It's not an overnight deal. It's just slow degrees. And I backed myself up this week, and I'm like, oh God, what is going on? What am I seeing? It's a tip. We're pushing a tipping point. And I think Lincoln has it right. And if we go to the Lincoln picture, I'm not sure what slide number that is, but just go to my... Yeah, there he is. By the way, I'm working on a Lincoln beard. Did you notice? That's what that's about. For freedom, right? I'm working on my Lincoln beard as a tribute to this guy and his powerful quotation that we're going to come back to in this series. Listen, friends, I love life. I love sports. I love family. I love the beauty of the fall season. I love life. I'm a happy guy, I hope. I live with a positive mentality. This is who I am. This is who you are. But I see a trend. And what Will, Meg, and Levi are going to have in about 30 years scares me. It scares me. Because everything is up for grabs. You can be born male, but yet you got to choose masculinity today. You can be born female, but you got to choose femininity. Nothing's a given. It's a scary trend. And what I'm saying is, we love life. Sure, the grace of God is great. But what I want you to see is, we're seeing in America, what we're seeing in the Judges, it's not just, okay, pull my circles up, okay? It's not just this kind of cycle that we're seeing, but that it's not just that, but it's this. And go to the next slide. It's a downward progressive trend. And it's pushing us toward a Gladwell phrase here, a tipping point. And I think Lincoln has it right. Back to Lincoln, if you would. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up among us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher, says Lincoln. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. What is Lincoln saying? He understood something a couple of centuries ago. He understood something. And he understood that when we are so free, that we flaunt the principles of good character, and we are so free that we flaunt the principles of God-given values, there comes a time, a tipping point, when we ourselves become our own worst enemies, when freedom runs to excess and breeds permissiveness and license and greed and selfishness, and we are determined to make more and more at any cost and compromising any moral value to do so, and leadership is without character, and business is without ethics, and education is without a true life purpose, and science and medicine are without human considerations. Friends, we're pushing a tipping point. Are we truly free? If we lead the world, the free world in the West, are we truly free if we lead the other countries of the world in the number of addicted people we have living in our land? By not even close, the number of addicted people in our country compared to others. Are we free? Is that freedom? Are we truly free if we are enslaved to our own pleasures? Are we free if we have many lovers, yet find so many broken hearts and lonely lives? Are we truly free? This morning, a hero must rise. A hero must rise. And I wonder if we are looking in the wrong places for our heroes. I mean, can we find a hero in the sports world where spoiled athletes are paid millions to do what we all need to do more of, exercise? Can we find a hero in the political world where politicians are firmly entrenched in a postmodern age who feel that it's time for America to be reduced to just another seat around the global table? Can we find a hero in the music world where songs about quote-unquote sexing someone up are the new anthems of a new generation? I mean, what happened to "We are the champions, my friend"? You know, where's that at? You know, and no, we got to sex somebody up. That's the new anthem of a new generation. Can we find a hero in the pornography industry where countless men and women are exploited and degraded to fill someone's pocketbook, and it's just out the yin-yang of availability in our world? Are we going to find a hero there? Can we find a hero in academia? And there are many God followers nested on faculty and staffs throughout America, but in most cases, especially in the secular university setting, unless you toe the party line of an evolutionary philosophy and worldview, you will be ousted from your job and position. Can we find a hero in academia? Can we find a hero in the world of art? Can we find a hero in the literary world where people write pieces that influence others toward the good and the wholesomeness of life? Can we find a hero in the construction world? We need a hero this morning. A hero. Someone uninhibited by societal trends. We need a hero. Someone who has neither fear nor favor of proclaiming and living the truth. We need a hero this morning. A hero who can be found. A hero who will have a Christian worldview. Not just a Christian in label. Not just I am a Christian this or a Christian that. It's talk is cheap, but a lawyer who is Christian in their worldview, a construction worker who is Christian in his worldview, an artist who is Christian in her worldview, a literary author who is Christian and operates from a biblical and Christian worldview behind the pieces that they write. We need people in the movie industry, in the music world, in the political world who will bring a good, godly worldview, not one of doing what is right in your own eyes, but authority bigger than us and greater than us and more wise than us to bring that authority to bear in our world. We need a hero to rise from the entertainment industry, the sports industry, I was going to say the political world, but boy, that's getting harder and harder to do. What organization this morning? What group of people is better set up to produce cultural heroes who honor God, who lift His Word up, who bring His worldview to the table as we process through the various issues? What organization is committed to this task? I will tell you what it is. It is the body of Christ. It's the local church. And she's alive and she's well and she can lead through this crisis. And that's what this is about. I don't care what happens in an election. I don't care what happens in political processes and decisions made. I am committed to leading this congregation through the quagmire and the turmoil and the decadence and the depravity that we see in our culture today. You're going to be led through it. I'm committed to it. I try to do what Jesus asked me to do, and that's what He's asked me to do. You lead this people through. You show them how to navigate the cultural trends today. You send out the call. You preach the word. I'll do the rest. I'll be faithful, but you proclaim the truth. I'm committed to it. Friends, heroes lift our heads. They stir inside each of us an ache for meaning and significance and purpose. Real heroes. Real heroes. They love family. They show us how to love a family. Real heroes love and parent a child. Heroes serve local church families and communities. Heroes impart wisdom and mentor wisdom into the next generation. And God doesn't always spotlight His special ones, His heroes that are doing the heroic in the out-of-the-way rural towns and villages and enclaves scattered throughout the great state of Indiana. He doesn't always highlight the heroes tucked away in these rural places, but society can feel their presence as we begin to seek God's face, as we begin to navigate the tumultuous waters of a spiritual dark age. And we see God raising up these heroes from within our midst. Friends, I really believe, I pray in Jesus' name you'll raise up some politicians who will lead. I pray in Jesus' name that you'll raise up some artists who can embed a Christian worldview in their artistic work. I pray in Jesus' name, dear God, that you would raise up a mom who will love her family and nurture that family. Raise up daddies who will lead their families, who will mentor not only their sons but others that in their lives. I pray in Jesus' name that the heroes will rise, that we will not produce a culture. We will not lend our influence and our abilities and our talents to a culture that's just going to continue to tear people down and tear society apart. God, in Jesus' name, raise up a hero. A hero must rise this morning. Have you ever wondered why our favorite stories include an ordinary person overcoming great odds to accomplish something extraordinary? It's because the capacity and the desire to be heroic resides in deep in each one of us. It resides in you. We're reminded of its presence when we watch a nice guy named Rocky Balboa beat the arrogant champ Apollo Creed. Our hearts thrill when a young, inexperienced Luke Skywalker destroys the plans of the mighty Darth Vader. From a simpleton named Forrest Gump